Right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. And welcome to this, the 12th webinar in the series that we've been running since COVID began. I hope you're all surviving well and getting through it. Now, most of our previous webinars have been on Edwin Lutyens' own work. One of them, though, was an overview of the work of Edwin Lutyens and Gertrude Jekyll working together on their houses and gardens. Gertrude Jekyll, as many of you will know, is credited with the launch and the extraordinarily rapid development of Edwin Lutyens' career. But it's also true that Edwin Lutyens, with his mastery of geometry and proportion, also influenced Gertrude Jekyll in return. And today, what this webinar will be doing is comparing and contrasting two famous gardens, one by Gertrude Jekyll working on her own, and another at about the same time, which was created as a joint venture between Jekyll and Lutyens together. These are the garden at the Manor House, Upton Grey, to the southwest of London, and Hestercombe, which is in Somerset in the West Country. Our panelists today will try to answer the question, how do Jekyll gardens, when she was working on her own, differ from those when she was working with Edwin Lutyens together? And we shall be using Upton Grey and Hestercombe as the examples to contrast and compare. Our panelists today are Rosamund Wallinger, who lives at Upton Grey, and by background, she was an entrepreneur. She was a bookshop owner, a professional chef, and her husband and she bought a derelict house at Upton Grey in 1984. That same year, they discovered that the garden was by Gertrude Jekyll, although in a complete state of abandonment. To cut a long story short, she caught the gardening bug and has spent the rest of her life restoring and caring for this wonderful garden. She's also the author of several books on gardening. And I bet you that she's the only panelist that we shall ever have who has been personally serenaded by Bing Crosby. And she's got a recording to prove it. The second panelist is Claire Greenslade. She is the head gardener at the other famous garden, Hestercombe, down in the West Country. This is a perfect example of a Jekyll-Lutyens collaboration. Claire started with studies at university in fashion and textiles that led on to an interest in stained glass. And although it may seem like a big jump at first glance, of course, that led on to gardening, which combines the same skills of combining color and design and with the earlier studies. And after several years of experience working in the gardening department of the National Trust at various different National Trust properties, she presides over the gardening team at Hestercombe. So welcome to the panelists. And just before I hand over to them, I'd like to make a couple of notes for you. One is that this session is being recorded and will be available to revisit if you want to in about 10 days' time on the websites of the Lutyens Trust America, of the Lutyens Trust here in the UK, where I am, and also on YouTube. Secondly, at the bottom of your screens, you will see a green tab. Oh, wait a minute. Is it green? My one's green. No, it's not green. Question Q&A. At the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A tab. Please use that if you want to raise any questions to type them in. And Marcus, who is running the technology for this webinar, will field as many as time allows, and the panelists will answer them. Right, with no further ado, I'd like to hand over then to Ros and Claire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I have had the best time of my life with this garden, and I've been watching the development of gardens over the centuries. And just to put our important arts and crafts gardens into perspective, it's interesting to see the evolution from 1700 to 1900, society changed dramatically. We had initially in the 1700s, Capability Brown, who had this wonderful vision of the great parks that surrounded the architecture of the houses he was displaying. The important thing was vista, and he was designing for only the affluent, the rich, the top of society and royalty, and the middle classes didn't exist. The lower classes were servile and in order. So when we look back at the great gardens of particularly Capability Brown, we see the start of great gardens in England and throughout the world. The next one, this slide, shows us the extraordinary evolution between his death, Brown's death, and Humphrey Repton, who was very luckily able to take advantage of the amazing collection of plants which our plant hunters were bringing back from around the world, literally. They were largely kept at Kew, and there at Kew they were cared for and then distributed to the nurseries of England, and that made the plants available to so many people. The Industrial Revolution is really the item that changes society so dramatically. That suddenly gives birth to a middle class, the self-made man, a professional, an industrialist who has money, but he still wants to make his mark on the world with his house and his garden. And he wants a practical house near his place of work, not thousands of acres, not attached to farmland and woodland. And it's an intimate association with garden and house. The next slide, please. And this is our Miss Jekyll, who luckily for her was born at such a propitious time. She was born in 1843, lived a long time, died in 1932, but she was a perfect, wonderful example of an affluent middle-class woman, a snob, as a lot of us and them are, and she is photographed now when she's in her late 40s, wearing, I think, the very hat covered with feathers that she wore when she was invited to tea with a near neighbour in Surrey, where she lived, Harry Mangles. Harry Mangles was an important rhododendron collector, and there were several people at tea, but the youngest and the quietest, almost, was young Edwin Lutyens. Lutyens was just 20, Miss Jekyll was 46, and she impressed him as he impressed her. He described her talking quietly and everybody listening, and the feathers on her hat forever prancing forward as she spoke. And then he adds, and he had this lovely sense of humor. He was a soft character, and she and he formed this wonderful relationship of affection throughout her life. He said, on leaving tea, Miss Jekyll handed me her card, having spoken not a word to me, and bid me take tea with her the following Saturday at 4 o'clock. I was there on the tick of 4. And this is the start of the evolution between this charming young man who was prepared to learn from Miss Jekyll because she had experience, knowledge, as Martin was saying, of the new classes around cities and towns who wanted a smaller, more practical house, fewer servants. And she knew these people. She'd already designed 13 gardens in 1889 when she'd met Lutyens, and she'd published several articles. So she was quite well known in her own field, and she introduced him to many of his initial clients. Next slide, please. This just proves a rather touching thing, because when I came to Upton Grey in 1984, Gertrude Jekyll was not completely forgotten, but certainly not well known by Joe Public, and Lutyens was immortalized in his buildings. But he did appreciate her. He turned to her for advice throughout his life, and always with a chuckle, and if they disagreed, it never ended badly. But here he is, kneeling down, and the cartoon says, I make obeisance, meaning I owe her an enormous amount. And he described her as Miss Bumps for the very obvious reason she was quite round. Now, the next slide will show us the lovely struggle he had to give her immortality. She was very well known in her own lifetime, but busy until the end of her life. And this is a portrait of her boots, painted in 1920, and it's peculiar standing on its own. It's because Lutyens begged her to sitting by his really wonderful artist friend, William Nicholson. And she said, no, I'm far too old, I'm unattractive, I haven't time. But she did so enjoy Lutyens's company and wanted to please him. So she agreed to sit for Nicholson, provided he came to her house, Munstead Wood, and painted her after dark in winter months. Well, that started another very dear relationship, but only for another 10 years. She died in 1932. But it just shows she had an ability to communicate with anybody, everybody, if they were genuine people. But my goodness, she was easily riled by people who would ask a question and then ask the next before she'd answered. She was a little temperamental. But when it was daytime and Miss Jekyll was out in the garden or busy writing, Nicholson had nothing else to do, so he painted this glorious portrait of her boots, a wonderful sense of humour he shared with Lutyens. So the next slide will show us the man who is responsible for commissioning Miss Jekyll for my garden. Charles Home, born and covered much the same time as Gertrude Jekyll, a slightly shorter life, was a very important arts and crafts figure. And remember, we're now in the arts and crafts period that we've arrived at through evolution. He had started The Studio, a very important arts and crafts magazine that opened the gate for so many crafts and raised them to the status of applied art. That was very important. So craftsmen were now considered artists. And this cartoon on the right is by Aubrey Beardsley, and it was a very brave publication that actually used Aubrey Beardsley as an illustrator, because he did profoundly obscene, if you like, for those days, but just beautifully drawn, rather shocking pictures looking at them today. Very soon, Beardsley died by the time he was 30, so they didn't employ him for long, but I have some wonderful copies of early Studio magazines. And now I'm going to show you the house that Charles Home bought and the tale of its garden. In the foreground is a cow field. To the right is the local church, and that is the old manor house that has stood there since 1500. And Charles Home came from Red House in Kent, which Webb had built for William Morris, bought a great deal of Upton Grey surrounding land and 2 major houses. This, his slightly minor house, he wanted to make a monument to the arts and crafts movement, so he employed Ernest Newton, as you'll see in this slide, as his architect. It's built on the bones of a sort of Tudor house. It hasn't got the bravery of Lutyens' architecture, but it's a charming house, and it stood in one side of it a cow field, the other side of it sloping slopes. It was finished in 1906, and Gertrude Jekyll was asked to design the garden in 1908, which is much the same time as she was working with Lutyens at Hestercombe. And she designed it with 19 plans for various areas altogether. This is the aerial picture, so you can see, and it is dramatically different from Hestercombe, but both are beautiful in a different way. This is a small, modest, and simple garden. In the foreground, you'll see a very formal garden with colours and herbaceous, small, 5 acres altogether, in fact, slightly under. And in the far side of the house, winding grass paths through trees and shrubs, running gently to a pond and nature in the distance. This is ecologically quite remarkable of Jekyll. She loved wild, free, meandering woodland as much, in fact, I think rather more than her formal gardens. But when you see Hestercombe with Clare, you'll see grand formality, which is just breathtaking. Next slide, please. And this is just to show you how her plans looked. There are several of them, And they survived thanks to your Beatrix found the Americas, who was also a great landscape gardener, a woman a lot younger than Gertrude Jekyll, but she'd met Jekyll towards the end of Jekyll's life. She'd admired her enormously, and when Gertrude Jekyll died, Beatrix Farren, thank goodness, bought all the plans, documents that were available, in fact, nearly all, and left them to the Reef Point collection at the University of Berkeley in California. So that is the reason why we can put back Jekyll's plans to how they looked 100 years ago. Thank goodness. Next slide, please. And this, just to give you a chuckle, is the house that John and I bought in 1984 from London. This is what my friends in the village called our Dolly London car. And we're looking from the top of the house through a window at the wild garden. Out of the house, these berries and green things are cotoneaster growing out of the roof. So this was a very good discipline. I had to be as economical as possible to clear, to replant. But the wonderful thing about nature, although it hasn't got the amazing ability to survive like a building can and Lutyens houses, it is restorable if you know what was there. And the next slide will show you, after about 15 years work, so not so very long, we've got this beautiful view, exactly the same view as the one before, of you entering the wild garden, greeted by rambling roses in the summer, running in the distance through walnut trees, unfortunately bamboo, because Charles Home loved Japan and Japanese art was very popular from the end of the 1800s to the beginning of the 1900s. And everybody was using it in furniture, materials, and in planting. And I have really ghastly, invasive bamboo growing in the wild garden that I just chopped down. I'm not allowed to cut it out. I've made this rule, but I cut it back furiously. And then we lead on to the pond and nature. Next slide, please. This is Claire at Hestercombe.
Hi. Unfortunately, unlike Ross, Hestercombe doesn't belong to me. It's a shame. But we are, just to sort of give you some background, we're an independent charity, open daily to the public as a visitor attraction. The estate itself is now just over 300 acres, and nearly 50 of which is gardens. So alongside the Jekyll and Lutyens garden, we've got 3 eras of garden design in one space. So we have a Georgian landscape garden dating from the 1750s. We have Victorian terraces, and then we have this fabulous collaboration between Lutyens and Jekyll, built in 1904, so really similar time to Upton Grey. Between the 2 world wars, the gardens fell into a lot of disrepair, as you can imagine. And in fact, in the Second World War, the estate was given over to the American Army to use as a base. And poor old Mrs. Portman was made to just use like a handful of rooms while the American officers were living in the house. And it must have been a really strange time for her, because she would have been, you know, in full Victorian veiled mourning garb while American soldiers were running around her estate. Strange times. She died shortly after the Second World War in the 50s, and then Hestercombe became home to the Somerset Fire Brigade. So all of the 999 calls came to Hestercombe. All their fire trucks were here. They did all their training here. And by 1974, Lutyens' garden had started to fall apart a bit. The pergola was unsafe and wobbly. The walls were collapsing. And the fire brigade were really keen to flatten the garden and to make a new training ground. They needed more space. So they had a vote, and we have the minutes of this meeting that was held at Hestercombe to vote on whether to flatten the garden or not. And Hestercombe just won by 1 vote, which meant that, you know, everyone had to sort of pull together to make it a safe space, and it started a long restoration project within the gardens. And as with any garden, the restoration project will go on forever and ever and ever. It's one of those. So the histories between Upton Grey and Hestercombe are quite different in the way the homes were. But I think you'll find as we go through the slides, they hold many similarities. I think the best way to describe it is in the feel of it, the atmosphere that they provide. Next slide.
Well, now we're going through the wild garden back at Upton Grey, which is relatively small, about 2 acres. You can see the massive bamboo on the left and the grass paths just meander naturally through. Wildflowers, which we'll see in the next slide, please, have sprung up everywhere, unplanted by me. It just shows that nature is a survivor. This gives terrific confidence to all of us these days. Masses of snowdrops of all types, Galanthus nivalis. And in the next slide, we have Star of Bethlehem, it was called, or Onophicoporum, something like that. I had to learn a huge amount. I mean, Claire had done a lot of training, but here we are at the pond now, looking back towards the house, and see how cleverly Jekyll has used her planting in the wild garden, not at all formally, but the next slide will show you the changing in season and how she's used plants in the distance that have vibrant colours in the autumn from every angle. And the next slide across the pond, it's a small pond, but it was naturally spring fed. See how beautifully the whole area is decorated with the glorious autumnal colours of autumn. And this is just using wild, naturally, harking back a little to Capability Brown in a way. Yes, that's it. I think we ought to look at Hestercombe, yeah.
The main difference for me, in a way, between the two gardens is Ross has a beautiful house. Unfortunately, the house at Hestercombe, I mean, I'm going to go as far as to say it's ugly. For whatever reason, Lutyens didn't gain the permission to remodel the house at the same time. It was probably a financial decision, I guess. And so that leaves us with a garden that is a standalone Lutyens design. I think it's the only one where he's only designed the garden, because normally he would remodel the house and the garden so they flowed between each other. So it's quite unusual. And I think because of the ugliness of the house, and he was so passionate that he wanted to change the house and wasn't able to, I think he then put his energy into diverting the eye away from the house as much as possible. And he used a lot of really clever techniques. So the garden has lots of levels. So wherever you are in the garden, the eye looks at the structure. The walls are all planted up. They all have flowers flowing through them. So if you're in the sunken part of the garden, you have a really tall wall that's really floriferous. So your eye never once gets drawn up. Either side of the sunken garden are these rills that you can see in the picture here. And as you walk towards them, they have these unique features, water features at the end, which is on the next slide. And so your eye is instantly drawn towards that. So I often wonder, then also we have at the end of the garden, there's a pergola which frames the view of the countryside. The waterways all flow away from the house. So it's leading you in that direction, and they have these beautiful features to distract you. And in the sunken centre, the paths are diagonal, so that again, you're never led, you're never sort of encouraged to look at the house. And I often wonder, without the ugly house, would we have such an outstanding garden? And so this is looking back at it through one of the rills. So these waterways are really precious to us. And then you almost don't notice the house, almost.
Well, we're back up to Grey now, completely different. But we're going to look at our formal garden, which is Jekyll's sort of modest scale of Hestercombe, but quite different too. We're leaving and we're coming to the formal garden. Here it is nothing but straight lines, no curved lines. The house has a pergola running to a rose lawn, beneath that a bowling lawn, and right at the bottom of the screen a tennis lawn. So she's designing a garden for a family who want sports, who want colour. It's a fun garden. It has no status, but it's very pretty. I think perhaps Upton Grey's garden is pretty and Hestercombe's garden is beautiful, to make a rather sad comparison. Now we'll look at it carefully, bit by bit, and I'll show you how she's composed this picture. So the next slide, I think, will show us the, oh yes, Hestercombe from the air to show.
So as a comparison, this slide is an aerial view over Hestercombe. If you look to the left-hand side of the house, this is where the landscape, Georgian landscape garden lies. And then you have this sprawling mass of Victorian house, which underneath it, part of it is medieval, part of it is Georgian, and it's just been layered and layered and layered. And then you can see the Victorian terrace, which was added on by the Portman family before the rest of the garden was commissioned. And it's a very sort of Victorian bedding plant scheme. And then it's all enveloped with this Lutyens and Jekyll design, which, as you can see there, looks really geometric from above.
And here we are back at Upton Grey to show you how Charles Home gave birth to the garden. Home's wife is standing on the left-hand side of the picture, and the whole house, before Jekyll designed the garden at all, is on a grass slope that runs to the white bench and then on down. Jekyll disliked grass slopes. She said they were hard to manage and a waste of space. So let's go to the next one, please. And this is the house we bought in 1984. This tumbling of green muddle and weeds is in fact covering the dry stone walls. And I was only 40, thank goodness. I didn't really worry about anything. I just had lots of energy and I couldn't get over every time we cut something down. Oh, how exciting. A massive tree on the right is a Leylandii, far too big, and we chopped that down. That made good firewood. Next slide, please. And this is much nearer the house to show you the grass banks that Jekyll had to change to dry stone walls and the beauty of dry stone walls. No wonder they were so popular. So next slide, please. And we're going to look exactly the same angle at the one dry stone wall. The next slide, please, shows you how wonderful they look, really early season. Before most of the herbaceous flowers have started, the walls are beginning to flower in February, March, April, all these little rock plants. Jekyll chose her colours so carefully. And in the walls, although the walls do need an enormous amount of upkeep and care, because dry stone is just literally stone slid into the earth, the plants in them like dry roots. They like facing the sun, and they just give this lovely, far prettier effect than a lump of grass running down. Next slide, please. This is you, Claire.
I love that last slide of yours, Ros. It's so pretty. It's so lovely. So this slide here, this is the Grey Walk. So this is the top balustrading there is from the Victorian garden. So it's gone from this very formal, very smart Victorian garden into a slightly wilder, well, planting-wise, slightly wilder garden. And Jekyll's use of plants here and across both of our gardens, I think, is really painterly, almost as a watercolour. The colours kind of blur and bleed into one another. They cascade from top beds down the walls onto secondary beds. You know, so the whole thing, that it really unites the whole garden together. We've even got planting plans for that Jekyll, says what to put in the walls. It's one of the hardest parts of my job, I would say, is trying to get something to establish within the wall. Because, back then, she would have, the garden team would have had young boys that could have walked around hosing down and spraying, but it's really hard to get them established. And then you have that fine balance between some of the plants that she suggests that we put into the walls actually make really big tap roots and break the walls apart. So you have that really difficult balance going on all the time. But I wouldn't be without them, and I wouldn't be without the flowers in them. I think they're really lovely. I always describe it as though Lutyens has put down the hard landscaping and Jekyll just throws a blanket of flowers over the top of it. you know, and anywhere she can, she puts flowers. And for that reason, I totally forgive myself for having daisies in the lawn. I feel like she probably would have approved, and it's no big deal. The other interesting thing here is that Lutyens uses the local stone. So this stone is actually quarried from the estate, and it's a seam of stone called mortslate. It's quite unusual, as most of the stone around the area is a much redder version, much redder in colour. Also locally, we have an amazing sandstone called hamstone, which is a yellowy in colour, easy to shape, easy to carve, and makes a great dressed formal stone. So I think it's really interesting that he chose this really rustic looking stone instead of something sort of posher looking, if you like. And I think it's very purposeful, and I think it changes the look of the garden. It's a great aid to Jekyll's planting, really helps it blend in with its surroundings rather than make a big statement and shout like the balustrades do above. It kind of just softens the whole thing. It's not so, it makes it look slightly less grand. Even the orangery, which we have at Hestercombe, which is designed by Lutyens, is mainly built of hamstone, but he uses mortslate within it as well. So it has that nice vernacular feel, and it fits into its own landscape. Next slide, please. There you go. And this is the last photo is one of mine. This is a professional photographer's picture, so you can see the difference. And we have to remember that I think that the way that Jekyll laid out her plants, to us now it's quite normal to put grasses, shrubs, herbaceous, annuals, all in one border together. But back then, this would have been really extraordinary, because the Victorian era was very much about carpet bedding or about showing off exotics. And yet here's Jekyll allowing plants to tumble over one another, to support each other, to create planting communities and overlays of texture and colour. Is so different from the Victorian culture. And it gives her a real chance to sort of play with colours and textures. And I'm sure she would have used Munster wood as her own training ground for that. Next slide, please. I think the next slide is going to show you how closely Lutyens and Jekyll work together, because the slide will show, there we go, Lutyens purposely left holes in the wall for Jekyll to plant into. So that's a really close relationship between an architect and a garden designer, I think, and that shows how much they appreciated each other's style, I guess. And this is a great example. Oh no, I've done that bit. Lutyens used a lot of clever trickery, and he also, both him and Jekyll had different skill sets that they took to different places. So the circular steps is probably, as most of you know, is quite a classic kind of Lutyens look. And it interests me because I think, again, it's working to soften an area, because if this was a straight set of steps, it would have a really different feel to it. So I feel like it romanticizes the garden. And he's really good at using the self-seeding plants, allowing all the cracks to fill, or she is, and embracing a sort of wilder, fuller look amongst all these like very orderly straight lines.
Now we're at Upton Grey, and this is just to show you that he loves circular, gentle movements, even into the wild garden, which is completely unformal. Grass steps lead you in a beautiful way, rather like the Hestercombe steps. And here at the bottom, you see the plan outlining them. Now, this is a look back to see how all architects, Lutyens and Jekyll and gardeners, if they could, would really frame the house, the architecture, and demonstrate its beauty, but balance it, because it's a heavy house with heavy walls leading down to the tennis lawn. At this point, I was going to say Jekyll was quite old by the time she designed Upton Grey. She was 65. Her eyesight, which had never been better than 6 inches, and by then she was wearing heavy glasses. She'd even gone to Germany for an operation on her eyes in her 50s, which makes you shudder to think. But she's a very practical gardener. She's given up close work, needlework, painting. She's talking about her gardens as painting the land with living things. And see how she loves this shallow step. Where there's space, it's a bit more, less economical of stone and space, but the steps from the bowling to the tennis lawn are just a very practical thing for a woman who wasn't all that agile, and by her age, certainly not able to pull a wheelbarrow up and down. An interesting thing between us is I don't think, as far as I know of Jekyll, that she ever visited Hestercombe. She may have done, but
No.
she certainly didn't visit Upton Grey. We're almost certain that all communication was done by letter, instruction, Royal Mail. She very rarely travelled far from Surrey by 1900, and this is 1908. So she's doing an enormous amount of her planning from plans that the architects have given her, and her ability to convert an architectural plan into a garden, I think, is quite extraordinary. A lovely thing that you said, Claire, about exotic plants. No, she didn't. Almost everything in my garden is something that was readily available, strong and easy to grow. There were one or two plants that were rather new to the world, like the appalling Japanese knotweed, Polygonum cuspidatum, which luckily, by the time she designed this garden, because she used it often in others, by the time she designed this garden, she was actually writing in her various circular notes to magazines, avoid Polygonum cuspidatum. Polygonum compactum is a far more manageable plant. So she's practical throughout her designs, and they work very prettily. Next slide, please.
And just to say, Rosamund, that the games area was part of the garden design, correct?
It certainly was, and that's another nice thing. It's a family house with a family garden, nothing grand enough to really do away with areas like that. So she's incorporated them for the family, and she's doing one quick thing, because this will apply to your garden too, Claire. At Upton Grey, she is a woman working for man, and she's definitely slightly trying to please them. She had a strong character, and if she disagreed vehemently, she did. But where possible, she just agreed with the owner. And that's why ours is a very comfortable family garden. And Hestercombe is, please make my garden magnificent, I think.
She must have been quite an unusual woman for her time, mustn't she?
Oh, yes, a spinster, poor darling, and very admired by both sexes for her intellect, not her beauty.
So this view here shows, as Lutyens would like, the view away from the house. This is from one of the windows upstairs. This is actually, I mean, how lucky is the accountant? This is his view out of the window where I work. Crazy. And I think what's really nice about here, you can see what we're looking down on at the front of the slide is the Victorian terrace. So that very formal kind of, ordinarily this is a bedding scheme, but this is one I've designed, so it's gone a bit wild. But below that, the sort of geometric layout of the formal gardens and the work between Lutyens and Jekyll. And I think you can start to see Lutyens' kind of trickery at work here, and how great he was as a garden architect. So things like, I think the rills are made to look extra long because the borders are actually quite thin, and the rill is actually quite thin. The borders are probably less than 2 meters across. So it's not like a huge, great herbaceous border. And yet Jekyll really makes the great use of these narrow beds. So everything is crammed in there. I think probably like me, she had a more is more philosophy. And we really try to emanate that at work, and I've always got a spare something to drop in somewhere. So I try and do succession sowings of annuals. So if ever a gap appears, I've got something to sort of bang in there and keep the floriferousness. Is that a word? Not sure that's a word. It's one I'm going to use today. So yeah, I just can't imagine that she would have been a minimalist, and yet she needs, in a way, in this garden, she needs those sharp lines of Lutyens to contain her.
Yeah, it's lovely, that comparison, isn't it? The further we look into it. This is just very brief. We'll look at her plan for the rose lawn. At the top of the screen, the house, the terrace with its pergola that leads to the rose lawn, a very important pergola, and then the bowling and the tennis. So now we'll look at it in the flesh as she hoped it would look. We came in '84. Here's the first photograph taken of the garden, the winter of 1983, actually. This is, well, no, not 83, January, February '84, no leaves virtually. Next slide, please. Actually, there were some leaves, it's just the garden looks so. Next slide, please. Oh, anyway, that is putting out the borders for the garden. A lot of hard work. We had all machinery, we bought nothing until we knew what we were going to need forever. And we marked from Jekyll's very clever mathematical plans exactly where each border was. It all fitted. Now there is Jekyll using, in a way, a Lutyens strong design, but softened so much with the pretty flowers that it looks like a rather young girl dressed up a little too grandly for the ball, I think. But I love this view. Midsummer, first of all, early flowering peonies, then later flowering peonies, and then iris, quite new to England, these iris, and right at the end of the year in the centre, Canna indica. So she's again very practical. She wants the season to be extended as long as possible with her planting, and her knowledge of plants gives you that extension.
And here's a plan of the sunken garden at Hestercombe. So this is probably what Jekyll would have received from Lutyens, and you can see her notes down the side there. It's really interesting because on all of the plans that we have of hers for Hestercombe, she actually indicates exact numbers of plants that she wants in the space. And I think it's quite interesting for me, having to sort of manage this garden and try and keep it as though Jekyll was there, if you like. It's really hard not to not make that look too blocky and too sterile when you're fed the kind of like recipe. So I really actively encourage all of the garden staff to read as much of Jekyll's writing as they can, because all the clues and all the hints that we need are actually in her books. So like we say, we don't think she ever visited Hestercombe. She certainly never gardened there. So it's trying to get into her mindset of understanding what she would have put in, how she, when one plant went over, what she would have put in its place. So it's quite, I often wonder if it's what she, 100 plus years later, whether if she came to visit me today, would it be what she was expecting to see? Or would she be actually just really angry with me for not embracing newer, more vigorous varieties? Would she sort of say to me, God's sake, why are you still using that rose? It gets black spot. Use a modern David Austin. I don't know. Thankfully, I'll never know because she looked really stern. I think I'd be frightened to death of her.
Yeah.
And the next slide, this shows, this is quite interesting from an architectural point of view. So this is the east side of the garden, and the top sketch is that's showing the elevation of the garden. So this is like a vertical drawing going down to the little circles on the left-hand side there, the little holes in the wall, the clairvoyants on the pergola. So that sort of gives you a sense of the scale. And then the flattened drawing underneath is the planting bed underneath that elevation. So she's got in there everything that you need, all the keys you need to make this border, I suppose. She even puts in, and in this case it's antirrhinums, but she even adds what annuals you should put in and in what colour order. That's really important to her. So the annuals run from right to left, sort of going down the hill, really hot reds, hot pinks, softer pinks, almost mauvey colours, and then it goes to white and then to yellow. So she's really got it planned out in her head as to how she wants it to look. And I love these photos. So the top photo shows the beginnings of, so the house has already been Victorianized. The tower there is a water tower that would have been gravity fed from a reservoir above it, and so they could have flowing water, that, you know, even a shower, which back then, you know, was an amazing showy-offy accomplishment, I guess. And you can see there the balustrading, which is holding in the Victorian terrace, but you can see then the land just slopes away, and so that's the sort of pre-Lutyens and Jekyll. The picture underneath shows the work in progress. So this is the mort slate that has been quarried from the estate, and there were a team of men that used dynamite to blow up the quarry to get the stone. I'm not allowed to use the dynamite anymore, but we do still use the quarry. And so it's not quite as exciting as it could be. But it amazes me. Ordinarily, I would correct myself on this, but the amount of manpower, ordinarily I'd correct myself and say people power, but back then this was literally manpower that would have gone into creating these gardens. But it's sort of quite nice in a way. I feel that a lot of men created this garden, and yet it was almost semi-led by a woman, as in Jekyll, and that Ros and I are both looking after these gardens as women as well. It's quite an interesting way of looking at it. You know, I'd never have got to have been a head gardener in 1904. And this view here just shows how full all the borders can be, the view away from the house. We've got all of the straight lines that were constructed by all that mort slate. So I love the mix of these sort of sharp edges and the fullness of planting.
And here we are in the Rosamund in Upton Grey, just to show you that it is actually breathtaking when you walk around the corner and you see peonies that flower according to the lactiflora, and the earlier and the later flowering peonies. They have a very long season. It's beautiful. Next slide, please. And when the next slide, when we see the next slide, oh, sorry, that's Hestercombe.
I'm going to skip on to the pergolas because we're running short on time.
Right, okay. Well, very briefly, the pergola will take you across the rose lawn. It takes you in a direction to, in the far side on the left, you can see a rose arbor. To Jekyll, it was important to have focal point A leading to focal point B with as much variety and beautiful as possible. And an important thing to Jekyll, wherever she gardened, was smell. You walk through jasmine officinalis, and you get the color of the roses and the beautiful leaves, but where she could, rosemary, jasmine, filling the edges. And here we are seeing on this side how Virginia creeper will keep in the center, go purpley red towards the end of the summer and keep the liveliness, not throughout winter, but as long a season as possible. It's a very clever planting.
And then this is the pergola at Hestercombe, which is almost like they're similar but polar opposites at the same time. So this pergola isn't built to lead you anywhere. It's used to sort of frame the view. And I think what's really interesting is you get that feeling that you're in an enclosed garden, but there's still glimpses through to this wider landscape. And at either end of the pergola, we have these oval-shaped sort of holes in the wall, like little windows, clairvoyants, I think they were called, that, again, you look out onto the wider landscape, onto the parkland. What we discovered when we had to restore this pergola was that the levels change ever so slightly. So the length of the columns changes ever so slightly as they go along. And when we actually looked at it, it would have been, as the land fell away, it would have looked really odd to make all the columns all the same size. So that's a really clever trick. And you'll see on that slide that some of the pillars are square and some are round. And I think that was very purposeful as well, because I think if they'd all been one or the other, it would have felt very austere and very formal. The planting on the pergola, however, very similar to Ros's: honeysuckles, roses, jasmines, all about a complete sensory overload of light refractions, smells, sights. You can see the little clairvoyant window at the end there.
Well, I'll very quickly here, it's just simply her plan for the main borders, which is how she's best remembered. Colour in the flower garden was herbaceous, and you'll see the plants running in drifts. We'll look at the next slide, please. In each case, she gives the name, the species, the cultivar, the amount, and to my great amusement, when I discovered this at Godalming Museum, her plant lists for Upton Grey only, nearly 3,000 plants provided from her nursery at Munstead Wood. And either Claire or you, Robin, said, yes, wasn't she commercial? She would supply as many plants as she could for her gardens from her own nursery. So no doubt she gave her own plants quite a good bit of prestige and publicity. But she's a commercial mind doing commercial things at a time when it was difficult, but she certainly got her accounts out to her customers. And here is the border looking at its best. I find herbaceous borders such hard work. And as Claire said, Hestercombe with shrubs and herbaceous is rather easier. But in the center of this border, which is 60 feet long, 10 feet wide, hot colors in the center, running out to cool colors at either end, moving in drifts. So planting beautifully and carefully. Next one shows you how in the autumn, the pale colors of spring, the hot colors of midsummer have given to an overall gold. I think this is like music at the end of the triumphant, whatever concert you're listening to. There's a boom, boom, boom of all the noise, which isn't nearly as beautiful, but they're doing their little gold coloring. And in the background, an enormous amount of important plants from the Americas. There is the mirror border opposite. Penelope Hobhouse was my great garden help. And she said that where possible, Jekyll would have a garden border reflecting that on the other side. But this faces north, the other faces south. In the center, bright red oriental poppies. And the next slide, please, shows you how it looks towards the middle and end of the summer. Still full and ebullient, but not quite the high, strong ones of the Americas. This is an American plant that Jekyll was it had been in England for quite some time, Hemerocallis, and this is Hemerocallis fulviflora plana, Quanzo. It grows almost like a weed on the west coast, but it's one she loved to use.
And that kind of extra dimension that Jekyll gives to a garden is that sort of extra dimension of time, and by that I mean like a seasonality. So this is the East Rill, and this is the West Rill. This is East Rill too. So they've both got that. So they start off early on in the season with lots of asters. With lots of irises. Then later on in the season, we get this run through of asters. So there's always this kind of up and down movement of plants coming and going to keep a look fresh. Can I have the next slide, please?
Panelists, we're running a little bit short of time.
Okay. There you go. There's a slide. Do you want me to?
Should we just go bling, bling, bling through them?
Yeah.
I think so.
Or do you want to stop completely, Martin?
Oh, well, quickly, if you can.
Right. Just go through the slides.
Very quickly, an overall view from the main herbaceous border to the kitchen garden in the far side. Jekyll, next slide, please, used her allowed for kitchen gardens because, of course, it's a family house. Now I use it as a source of plants for replacing in the main borders because after 38 years, some plants weaken. But it's beautiful. Next, good. Going down the spring, the summer, the next one, please. See how the colors change. They're all Jekyll plants, but used at random, not artistically. And it's still rather a triumphant look at just nature doing its own thing, like naughty children in a swimming pool. She leads to a seat. She puts this seat where she wants you to sit, isn't she? Practical, with a view of the garden along the bowling lawn. It's all very peaceful. The last one is me mowing the lawn way, way back a long time ago. Dogs thinking it's tea time. Duck was the only survivor after the fox. And it was on the front of American House and Garden. And suddenly everybody wanted to come and see it. The cover of my second book, all about the earnest gardener and the actual plants. And the other book was about the catastrophe of starting from scratch. This, I say, applies to every gardener. Keep it up, don't ever give up, and enjoy it.
Frog is strangling me.
Oh yes, goodbye to nature. Winter comes, kills it all, and it revives. I love these months. I don't have to work much.
Wonderful. Claire, have you?
No, I'm happy with that. It's a lovely finale.
Okay. Well, congratulations to you both. Marcus, could I ask you to field a few questions?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. One was who painted the lovely aerial plan of Upton Grey, and somebody else was it by Jonathan Miles Lee?
Yes, it was. He became a great friend. It's a lovely tale how he became a friend. Have you got a minute? It's literally. He arrived, a rather shy, worried young man. I sat him in the kitchen to discuss price and everything, and a coachload arrived. And I'd forgotten completely, like I forget so much. And he and I ran up scones and cream and did the most amazing event. And they didn't know I'd forgotten at all. So that's Jonathan.
And the painting has pictures of your family all throughout at the tennis lawn.
Yes, you're right. Yes, everybody doing what they love. John at a table sitting reading a newspaper.
And you're gardening.
Yeah, but he pays for it.
The questions, Marcus?
There's a question from Andrew Rajic, a question for Roz. Do you think that Jekyll would have embraced the modern prairie style if she was gardening now?
Do you know, I think she must have, because she had an eclectic mind and an appreciation of everything natural. Now, it's difficult to make it magnificent, but there's something called Sussex Prairie Gardens in England that does just that, largely influenced by Pete Adolf. And it's breathtaking, but in a completely different way. And it's modern. I think she would have learned to love it like you can learn to love any art if you study.
That's a nice answer. There's one last question. From John Beverley, how did you discover that Jekyll had designed the garden at Upton Grey?
You know, it's so lucky we bought it because it was very, very cheap close to London. Gilly Drummond was a great friend. She started the Hampshire Gardens Trust, said, I believe it's a Jekyll garden. She introduced me to Penelope Hobhouse, Richard Bisgrove, and then the world surrounded me with, yes, this is how you get the plans. England is a country of gardeners today, not shopkeepers.
So that's all the questions that we have for today. Would you like to wrap it up, Robin?
Yes, thank you all for listening. Thank you for coming. If you would like to support the work of the Lutyens Trust America or the Lutyens Trust, we would love to have you join us as a member or as a donation. I want to let you know that the Lutyens Trust in the UK is developing a complimentary lecture series that you'll be receiving information about. Their first lecture will be this coming Tuesday on Old New and New Old Edwardian houses. So thank you again.
Thank you.